semuanya. Terima kasih sudah menyempatkan waktu, tenaga, finansi, dan uang untuk hadir di acara book discussion hari ini. Pertama-tama saya mohon maaf sama panitia Pustok atas keterlambatan waktu mulainya acara karena satu dan lain hal. Dan saya mengucapkan selamat datang kembali dalam acara book discussion Majapahit Nusantara Game of Thrones hari ini di Kalipus Hubungan Berawal di Bali. Om Swastiastu, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Sadu. Senang sekali rasanya bisa menyapa teman-teman dari Universitas Udayana, ada teman-teman dari arkeologi. Terima kasih sudah menyempatkan hadir. Teman-teman dari Fakultas Ilmu Sosial dan Ilmu Politik juga. Bapak Ibu yang sudah menyempatkan waktunya hadir. Sekali lagi saya ucapkan terima kasih sudah menyempatkan hadir. Dan saya juga mengucapkan terima kasih kepada teman-teman dari Karipus selaku komite telah menyelenggarakan acara hari ini. Dan perkenalkan, nama saya Tari selaku MC pada acara discussion hari ini yang akan maju jalannya acara. Dan bersama saya di depan Bapak Ibu hadirin sudah hadir dua pembicara kita yang akan mengisi book discussion bertajuk Majapahit Nusantara Game of Thrones. Pertama, Pak Herald boleh berdiri. Saya perkenalkan, beliau adalah Herald van der Lien, seorang analis ekonomi dan juga banker di HSBC Hong Kong, contoh sedikit. Boleh kembali. Pak Herald ini di Yogyakarta, akrabnya disapa sebagai Mas Heru. Tapi kalau di Bali, bolehlah kita panggil Bli Heru. Kemudian Pak Jun bilang, jangan panggil Bli Heru, panggil Guru Heru. Ya apapun itu silahkan kembali ke preferensi Bapak Ibu masing-masing. Selain itu, Pak Herald juga, Pak Heri katanya Pak, gimana? Boleh, terserah katanya, boleh. Selain menjadi banker dan juga analis ekonomi, Pak Herald juga merupakan penulis dari beberapa buku, betul ya Pak? Dari buku Jakarta History is Misunderstood City and Asian Stock Markets from the Ground Up. Boleh kita berikan tepuk tangan untuk Mas Heru. Dan sudah hadir juga Bapak Wayan Juniarte, Om Swastiastu. Bapak boleh berdiri juga Pak, menunjukkan wajahnya ke para hadirin yang sudah datang. Mana ya? Bapak Wayan Juniarte ini akrabnya dipanggil sebagai gimana Pak? Mau dipanggil apa Pak?
Oh, saya
Paduka yang mulia Raja. Yang terhormat Bapak Wayan Juniarte. Boleh dipanggil Pak Jun atau Bli Jun atau Paduka Raja juga boleh. Terserah teman-teman mau panggil apa. Boleh Pak, duduk sudah capek sepertinya. Pak Jun ini sebetulnya merupakan jurnalis, wartawan, tapi kalau kita sering lihat di event-event budaya, beliau sering dihadirkan untuk memberikan pendapatnya dan hadir sebagai pembicara dan memberikan wawasannya dalam perspektif pengamat sejarah, budaya, dan seni. Baru 2 hari yang lalu, ya Pak ya, hadir di Festival Sastra di Kurikau Hollywood sebagai panelis juga, berdampingan bersama dengan Ibu Awi Martini dari Kementerian Pariwisata dan Ekonomi Kreatif Republik Indonesia. Boleh berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah untuk juga. Memang dari luar kelihatannya agak low-key gitu, menunduk terus, tapi ketika berbicara gitu nanti kita yang diem, kita yang melihat beliau dengan wawasannya yang luas gitu ya. Dan tanpa berlama-lama lagi, saya harus menjelaskan secara garis besar jalannya acara book discussion kita. Itu nanti akan dibagi menjadi 3 sesi. Sesi pertama pembukaan sudah selesai, dan kedua pemaparan materi dari kedua pembicara, dan ketiga di akhir nanti akan ada juga sesi diskusi interaktif bersama para hadirin, dan kita akhiri dengan sesi foto bersama. Sebelum kita mulai, ada baiknya kita berdoa bersama dulu untuk memulai kegiatan ini dengan penuh kesadaran dan kebajikan supaya ilmunya nanti kita bisa gunakan dengan baik. Berdoa menurut agama dan kepercayaan masing-masing. Saya persilakan. Berdoa boleh diakhiri. Di sesi book discussion show di Bali hari ini, kita akan membicarakan soal penemuan kisah Majapahit, sebuah sumber informasi yang ditemukan berkaitan dengan kerajaan Majapahit yang ternyata ditemukan secara tidak sengaja oleh seorang ahli yang ikut dalam penyerbuan Lombok pada tahun 1894. Tanpa berlama-lama lagi, kita sambut dengan meriah Pak Heri.
If I need the microphone, but I'll do it anyway. I hope you can all see the presentation. I will present in English, because I'm not quite sure if everybody speaks Indonesian, but let me say something in English very quickly. Terima kasih atas hadirannya. Juga nanti kalau ada pertanyaan boleh di bahasa Indonesia juga. Saya coba menjawab di bahasa Indonesia juga. Kalau yang salah ucap, mohon dimaafkan. So kita lanjut di bahasa Inggris dulu. Nah, satu dulu. Ini dibikin oleh rekan saya, bagus kan? Satu lagi. Satu sebelumnya dua lagi. Before I start to talk about the book and the story, I'll very briefly say something about myself, why I wrote the book, and also how I wanted to try to write the book. I arrived in Indonesia in 1990 as a backpacker, also came to Bali. Actually, they told me to start in Bali at the time because Jakarta, if you fly there, they said you get lost in the big city. So I started here in Legian, if I'm not mistaken, my first nights. And then I traveled east in Indonesia before I went back to Jakarta. That was my finishing sort of station. When I traveled east on a ferry boat, I met a family who came from Jakarta. We could hardly communicate, but we had a bit of contact. And they said, if you're in Jakarta, give us a call. So I was in Jalan Jaksa 2 months later in Jakarta, and I gave them a call. You didn't do that on mobile those days, 1990, so in a phone booth. And they said, what are you doing in Jalan Jaksa? Check out, we pick you up. So I was picked up about 2 hours later, and I was about to stay with them maybe for 1 or 2 nights. That was the plan. I stayed with them for 6 months. And the year after, I came back and stayed for another few months. I brought my dad for the first time to Indonesia. The year after, the third year, I wrote my thesis. I studied economics at Bank Indonesia and stayed with them. So I stayed with them for a long time. They spoke no English whatsoever. They were not very rich people. They had no car, small house, but they gave me a room. And we struggled to communicate, so I had to speak Indonesian. But not only that, they would bring me to their other family, and if they would makan teh, so makan tangan, I ate whatever they ate. They took me to their families. If there was a birthday, club puasa, saya ikut puasa when they were fasting, I did this as well. And I started to see Indonesia, I think, from a very different kind of way as a lot of other foreigners do, which is a little bit description of the first book. Jakarta is a misunderstood city. Now, you live in Bali, so maybe you also have a view of Jakarta that is like it's a city with traffic jams and it's full with people, and that's absolutely right. But where I lived in Pasar Minggu, there were all these small alleys and streets with bakso vendors and people serve soto or nasi uduk, and very friendly. So there was a part of Jakarta that I thought was really, really beautiful. I don't like the traffic jams in Sudirman either, but the other part I think is really, really beautiful. So that by accident, actually, I started to write a book about the history of Jakarta. And for me to understand Indonesia, it wasn't only about learning the language or eating the food, but also to understand where this place came from. And I always felt somehow, I don't know why, that the seeds of what this place is now, of course in Bali in particular, but the rest of Indonesia as well, started with Majapahit. So it always fascinates me, I want to write about it. There's a second reason I want to write about the book. It's very simple. If I ask my colleagues, I work in the research department in Hong Kong, very well educated people. We have PhDs and professors and masters, people in our department. If you ask them what is Majapahit, which I once did, they have no clue. First of all, somebody once said, I think it's a cookie. Is it a cookie, Majapahit? No clue whatsoever. Somebody thought it was a cookie. Somebody else said, no, it's Mahapajit. She's Indian. And she translated it to Sanskrit, and she thought it was maybe something Indian. The fact that they do not know anything about Majapahit, although it's so well known in Indonesia, tells you something about the state of knowledge about Indonesia maybe in general. This is a G20 country, one of the biggest economies on the planet. In my country, I'm originally Dutch, just thrown out of the G20 quietly. Indonesia is organized here in Bali not too long ago. In the next 10 years, this could well be a G10 country, if it continues at least on the path it is at the moment. And very few people know about it outside of Indonesia. People read a lot. China, and India, and England, and France, and the US, of course. But Indonesia, a lot of people don't know about it so much. So somebody needs to tell them the story. There's a third reason I want to go, but I want to tell you that at the end, just to keep attention going a little bit and make sure that you stay attention as well. Then the question, if you want to write a book about Majapahit, how do you want to do it? Now, my wife told me if there's one thing she didn't like at school, it was history. It is boring. Because apparently, in Indonesian schools, you have to have to remember all the dates and the whole thing. No, here you see the reaction to this. It means so. Tadi yang bilang dia tidur di kelas. So we slept in class because we found it so boring. But actually, Indonesian history is actually full with fantastic stories. Some of them are a bit mythical, some of them we'll talk about in a second. Some of them we don't know if they're mythical, but probably are. Some of them are probably have happened. So there's fantastic stories, and I try to tell it in a way that my son or my own family, my Ponakan, or other younger people would like to read it as well, in a very narrative sort of way. So any technical discussion about when was Ken Arab born, or when was Hayaburu became the king, or whatever, that you need to understand to write a book, but I put this all in footnotes. So if you want to go technical, fine, go into the footnotes. We try to create a narrative, and I'm going to tell you that narrative, right now actually. So we spoke about Kanata, why I wrote a book next week, and also how I wanted to write a book, and now we're going to go to the next slide. Something like that. So we're going to look briefly, where is Majapahit actually? And that might seem very obvious to you, but I found out actually we also get in region, but in particular, of course, foreigners, no clue where it is. And I'm going to highlight one particular personality. I suspect it was quite a personality, Captain Negara in particular. We're going to talk about also then the making of Majapahit and Prapanca. And if there are three characters, I was at a school a few days ago in Jogja to talk about this. I think this is a kind of a long story. I thought I'd just talk about three characters, and I talked about Gajah Mada, because everybody knows. Captain Negara, because I think he deserves some more attention. And I spoke about Prapanca, because if there's one person you know something about from the 1350s or so, it's Prapanca. He apparently would like to have an history in life and failed to do so. He was told he smelled and wasn't really romantic. He liked to drink quite a lot, I have the impression sometimes as well. So he tells us a couple of things about himself, including that the very book that we use as a basis, the Negara Kertagama, he called it the Desaranana, he thought it would be a failure and probably never be translated and people wouldn't like it. And of course, it's a description which in those days people thought it was just boring actually. So he considered himself a failure, while actually he's now such a big personality in Indonesian history. Click. Now, first timeline, just to set the stage a little bit, click. This took me an hour to make this slide. I moved to YouTube to figure out how this is very nice. So we start actually in Kediri, in the very early stage. We got Erlangga. He's the king in probably an area what is across the Lama now, which is to south of Surabaya. And when he died, he decided to give one part of his piece to one son and another piece to another son. Now that set up problems if you do that as a king, because your sons are going to fight all over the place, and that's exactly what happens. But in order to separate the lands, he asked them. Now this is probably mythical, but maybe not for you. He asked the magician to fly over the lands and separate, make the magical separation between the lands. Now, the guy did so, flew through the air, apparently, and got stuck in a tamarind tree. Now, he was really pissed off and said, listen, tamarind tree, you will never grow really big, you stay here. But the symbolic thing is that he was not able to separate the lands. That means it set itself open for somebody to unify the lands at some point in time. And that happened, because we have a guy, Ken Argo, who eventually is a robber, rapist, not a very good guy. He rises up through the ranks and he becomes the king in Singasari and then takes over Kediri and unifies the lands. That happened in 1222. He then eventually dies. That in itself, the whole story, he got killed by somebody who thought he was a Sari. Anyway, we don't have to go there. And then we have a period of a lot of unrest, but then a new character emerges. We'll talk about this in a second. Captain Negara. Captain Negara, his father appointed him as king as a little boy to make sure that the infighting in the family that had happened for about 30 years by the time he was born would come to a stop. He said, you become king, everybody will know that you are the king. I am, of course, his father was the guy who was in charge. But by the time he would die, it would mean that everybody would have accepted Captain Negara as the king. It wasn't really the case, because he had to fight off a few rebellions by the time his father passed away and died, but he actually then unified the lands one more time. We'll talk about this in a second. And I think he's underappreciated sometimes a bit. Then we have the period whereby Majapahit rises. We'll talk about this, how this happens. Captain Negara dies, Majapahit rises, and of course that's the time of Gajah Mada, Hayam, the big heroes in Indonesian history. And actually after that, the moment Gajah Mada dies, the thing starts to fall through quite quickly. In the book, I assume that the end date of Majapahit is in 1527 for a very simple narrative reason. It was the day that of the year whereby Jayakarta was, the town of Kelata was renamed Jayakarta and then became Jakarta. So it's a very nice sort of narrative from old Indonesia to new Indonesia. But to be honest, after something like 1470s, 80s, we don't really have a lot of evidence that Majapahit was still there. Next one, please. Where is it? This is Indonesia as it was in the 1350s, so some of all the names of those days. Malacca is the only one that didn't really exist. Next one, though we see Majapahit there. Click next one. Then we go to Java, so that's close to Surabaya, just to make sure everybody knows. It is now pretty much where Mojokerto is. Next one. And now click one time. No, one Kabbalah. Click. And then second click like that. Yeah. So what we see here is Singasari and Kediri, the two towns that oppose each other. That's the whole story to a large extent there. And you can see Majapahit is on the middle. It is the city, the location of Majapahit, I believe, is actually chosen for a reason. It is the very place where this guy got stuck in the tamarind tree and was not able to separate the land. So that's the place where the unification of the lands can also take place. And one thing, I'll show you this in a second, but one other thing I'd like you to see is, click on something like it. All the temples there, if you go there are beautiful temples, but they're not really big. With the exception probably of Panataka, which I think I've been there, I don't know how many times now. Every time I go there, I ask the guy, the Jogunchi, the guy in the guards, how many people have been here the day before? 4, 5, 10, 12, mostly Indonesians, foreigners, hardly here, but not a lot of people go to this place. But I would say after the Borobudur and the Brahmana, and maybe one or two other places in Indonesia, this ranks as one of the fantastic assets that we have, but it is not very well known. A lot of Indonesian friends of mine have never been there either. If you've ever got a chance to see one temple, I'd say go to Panata. But the story is there are many temples there, not one big one, not one big Borobudur. And you would think that a big empire would have one big temple. I think there's a reason for it, and I'll tell you in a second. Next one. We go quickly back to where Majapahit is located. And you see, this is Canggu, that was a training place. You can see Bubat, which is a place where maybe or maybe not, the war has been fought at some time. And then you go to the very south and you can see the Majapahit Palace there. And it's very close, click one time, to Murari. And Murari is a place where supposedly this tamarind tree is. So Majapahit is literally placed on a place that is identified as the place where we can unify the lands. Jayakarta is the other temple, which is of course an icon of it, and just highlighted as a really thing to see. This is just an emblem from the Penanggalang temple, which I do to go to next chapters. We do these other temples as well. So we go to the next one. This is the next chapter. So very quickly, to set ourselves up, why Majapahit emerged. And I have to say something about Kertanegara. But before that, very quickly, this is Candikino. Candikino has got a very big car for the size of the temple, rather big. Because the son of Ken Argo found out that Ken Argo was not his father, and actually Ken Argo killed his biological father, and he decided to kill Ken Argo, the guy who unified the lands 1222. He killed it knowing that the real sons, the biological sons, if you want to put it like that, were going to kill him as well. So he knew he was taking a big risk, and indeed he was killed, probably soon after. I know some things. He put up his temple, I suspect, maybe because the big Kala, because he knew not only in this life, but in the future lives, they reincarnate, they could still chase him as well. So he tried to put up maybe a Kala there in order to protect himself as well. The Kala is quite outsourced. Anyway, we have a lot of infighting between these sons, and as I mentioned earlier, next slide, we find the rise of this little boy, Kertanegara, who becomes the king. Something happens on a particular day, and I'm going to tell you something now about this particular motive you see here. On a particular day, and we're going to talk about this in a second, we see after a moment in time a flourishing of different motifs in the statues of the Singasari statues that we have found. So a lady called Leslie Bullen, she's done a lot of research on it, and she says it was simple for a long time, and suddenly an explosion of all sorts of motifs, in particular these interlocking circle motifs. Because these circles, these clothings, if you would wear them, they will protect you. If you had a big upacara, a ceremony, a magical powers were released, you needed to protect yourself against this. And therefore they had these motifs. Interlocking sort of circles is a sign of strength, protection. And if you can think of it and you do a little bit more with this, you can find batik motifs out of this. So this is maybe very well the start of some of the batik motifs that I myself here am wearing today. Next slide. Now, when Indonesia became independent, it changed the Dutch street names and made them Indonesian. Good point. So the big streets in Jakarta at the time, Molucca, they changed it to Jalan Hayamuruk and Jalan Gajah, the big heroes of the time. And that is right in Jakarta, there are big lanes. Next slide. This is Jalan Kertanegara. It's a small road close to Blok M, where hardly anybody comes, although the future president of Indonesia happens to live on this particular street. So there is significance to it. But in a sense, he was not appointed in 1945 any big road. Therefore, maybe is a signal that he wasn't seen as important as Gajah and Hayamuruk. Well, I actually think he might well be. Next one. He became the king, and then after 1269, there's an inscription, which I think is actually quite important. In the inscription, he does a couple of things. He gives power to the local religious leaders to become tax exempt. A lot of the inscription is all about tax exemption, but he did this mainly in order to gain support from the local leaders and to build their own temples, which is probably why there are so many temples in the region and not one big one. Some of the temples, in Natarang, the ones from his forefathers, like we just saw Kidal or Tago, those were under royal protection, but all the other temples people would take care of themselves. So we have a flourishing of smaller temples. But he did that maybe in order to gather domestic support from the clergy, from the religious, powerful, influential people across the region. He solidified, it seems, his domestic position. He kicked out his vice premier, his key minister, the party. He changed that, and some of his closer friends, with whom he lived for a long time and grown up, became his key advisors as well. But he didn't throw the old guard away and get appointed different jobs. He did that maybe, secondly, because the geopolitics in the region started to change. So here we got Singosari. It was on the crossroads in those days of three trade roads, say from the Spice Islands to Java, from India to Java, from China to Java as well. So it's an important thing. But now we'll see what happened in the region as well. Click on the next one. the Mongols were coming. Kublai Khan had gone all the way to Italy and Hungary and these places and decided to go south and towards Korea and Japan as well. He invaded Vietnam, he invaded what is now Thailand and also what is now Burma. So if you then think about it, if he could control that region there, his ships could go further south to what is now Singapore and set up a base there and just force every ship to go to Singapore and not to Singasari in Java. Now, if that would have happened, that would have been a massive problem for Singasari because all your trade is gone, the money is gone, the power and influence is gone, and you become a small empire. So, Captain Nagara had to do something, and he did this in two ways. One, he first went on a military campaign. Probably, he first went to make sure that his back door, so he wouldn't be attacked from the back. He went to Madura and he went to Bali here. And probably attacked it and made sure that he had this under control. Then he went also to Borneo and he went to Sumatra. This is probably 1280s or so. And that's called Pamalayan. The move to Malayan was Sumatra in those days. So he secures and he puts his army right in the locations there to make sure that he can control these waters. That's really important. He also does something else. He needs to get spiritual power as well. The story was that Kublai Khan himself was elevated to a kind of enormous being, a sort of Buddha. So he needed to get that spiritual power as well to stand up against this man in Beijing, what is now Beijing. So he did that. There were a couple of ceremonies for him to gain that, and there's a statue which might well show him doing that. Okay, one click. This statue was for a long time in the Netherlands, it's now back in the National Museum in Jakarta. But you can see somebody being really involved with tantric sort of ceremonies. That means dancing at midnight, at the graveyard, drinking, singing, incantations, all these things fit into that. So he gained spiritual and military power in order to protect what is now Indonesia, you could say, against a potential influence from the north, from the Mongols. So you can see some of the geopolitics today are maybe not too different actually. Next slide. When he had done so, there is a particular ceremony that takes place on the 21st of November 1289, we know it because it's written down on a statue, in Burare, in that very place where the symbol of unification takes place. And my suspicion is, and it was only more than a suspicion, he had that ceremony there. Majapahit didn't exist yet, right? So he had that ceremony there in order to show that he had unified the lands once again. This was the symbol of unification. This is where he got Kalimantan, Bali, Madura, Java Barat, we don't know, West Java, and Sumatra under his control. In a sense, this is the first time that you would say large part of what is Indonesia came together for the very first time. Now, then, next slide. A lot of things happen very quickly. One, we have Umuraya in 1289. He is now unified. He's got the spiritual strength and the military strength to stand up against Kublai Khan. Two, next slide. 1290, Meng Qi, a diplomat from China, arrives in Singasari and says, listen, you're a nice guy, but let's make a deal. You just say that you are a vassal of Kublai Khan. We're happy. Yeah, he gives you a few birds, maybe a gift, something like that. To symbolize this, we have a small ceremony. And you are part of the Kublai Khan empire. You can do whatever you want. That's maybe what he proposed. Maybe he asked for one of the four daughters of Captain Nagara to come to Beijing as well. Captain Nagara stood up and basically told him, no, and cut off the nose. Some say the ear, we don't know, but anyway, the nose sounds good. And cut off the nose of the diplomat. Imagine if any country would take the American embassy and cut off his nose and send it back to Washington. Responsibly, you've cut off the nose of the representative of the most powerful man on the planet in those days. That is a big statement. He was ready to do so, and he did. And of course, what is the response going to be? He could expect that a lot of these people from China are going to be upset, Kublai Khan involved, and send a big army. And that's exactly what happened. Kublai Khan, 6 months later, hears about this, he's outraged, and says, prepare me an army. He had 3 admirals, not one, 3 admirals to lead thousands of hundreds of ships to Java to teach these people there a big lesson. In the meantime, the problem for Captain Gary is that his army is now located in Sumatra, in Borneo, there's no Kalimantan, maybe some here, I don't know, spread out. And that was a chance for Kediri to hit back to Singasari. And opponents that came back, somebody was involved, there's a bit of a tricky character involved, you can find it all out in the book. But Kediri attacks Singasari and is able to kill Captain Negara. So Captain Negara dies just before the start of Majapahit, but actually has already appointed and set the conditions for this empire to rise. Clear? And then you got the invasion in 1293. About a few months later, the Chinese arrive, or the Mongols actually in those days, and they're asking, where's Captain Negara? We're going to teach him a lesson. And they say, well, the guy's dead. There's a new king in Kediri now. I said, okay, what do we do now? Then a guy shows up and says, listen, I am the son and supposed to be son-in-law of Captain Negara. I can be appointed king. I'll ask all the people around. And I will submit myself to Kublai Khan if you help me to kick these people in Kediri out of the banks. The Chinese said, okay, we'll do that. We're happy. And then we can go back and tell them we got our new king over there, but he's still part of Kublai Khan. They do that. They have the war, they win the war, and then the guy says, listen, tomorrow we do the big ceremony, well, we will follow Kublai Khan, tonight we party. And they had a day party. Now, the Mongols get drunk, not the Japanese. And then by midnight, they take up the knives and kill the Chinese Mongols. No, not everybody gets killed, must have been a slaughter. They ran off to the ships, the admirals are back in the ship and saying, what are we going to do? We're going to fight these people, we don't know these lands. It's hot here, let's go back home. So they go back. They get punished initially by Kublai Khan, but later they're reinstated. So the Mongol invasion is an absolute disaster. One click. We can actually see on some of the, this is from Penattaran, some of the things that how these wars took place. And I use these inscriptions, the elephants, for example, in the book to describe this to a certain extent. What you do not see here, but which I've written down in the book, is that you probably also had doctors with swords, because warfare in those days was not pleasant. People's arms and legs had to be cut off. They probably had all sorts of pasts to help them, maybe drinks in order to make sure that they could deal with the pain and these sort of things anyway. But what we also see here at the top is a cannon. It's the first time we see that cannons are being used. So the Chinese brought in cannons and also grenades, Chiapao it's called, and they were used in that war with Kediri. And maybe because they ran off, a lot of them left. So suddenly you have some weaponry and military equipment and knowledge that arrives in this place as well. Next slide. Now then, Captain Negara is dead, another king is being appointed, another son is being appointed, but one of the daughters of Captain Negara really remembers her father's probably dream to unify the lands, that ceremony where she was as a small younger lady in Bunare, and she probably, I guess, wants to keep that dream alive and bring it back. But she is a lady that plays a role in the background, Gayatri is her name. She needs a young and ambitious kind of guy in the army, who's got support in the army, who's clever, she can deal with, she was probably a clever lady as well, who can do this for her. And who's that? That's a new sort of guy that comes up with Gautamana. So she aligns herself eventually with Gautamana. You can see Gautamana initially actually was very supportive to one king, but is then probably involved in the murder of that same king as well, Jayanagara. So he changes alliances in the early part of his life and aligns himself probably with Gayatri. And through another couple of conquests, eventually he becomes the big party, the big vizier of Majapahit. And then you have the king, later born Hayam Wuruk, who becomes the king at the peak of this. But I found Hayam Wuruk, to be honest, sometimes a bit of a questionable sort of figure. We don't always see him in front of the wars. When he gets married, this is in Bubat, when he's about 30 years old, he's supposed to get married to a princess from West Java. Imagine, you married with somebody from West Java. Actually, I'm married with somebody from West Java. But anyway, when she arrives from far, comes to your place, she arrives there, you would like to go out and greet her. He doesn't do that. Gautamana says, you wait and sit, I'll go and greet them. Gautamana doesn't do that. Now, we don't know all these stories because we only know they've written down through the words of the Sudanese. So they probably wrote it in such a way that it suited their interests. But at least you don't have the feeling that he was a very strong sort of king that stood up and said to Benjamin, no, this is my right to go out and say hello to her father, and who was king as well, and daughter. So my impression is he was art-loving, quite nice, and was very much involved with cockfighting and these sort of things, and dancing, he liked. Exactly. So, but he wasn't really, I don't know. And you see also that by the time Gajah Mada disappears from the scene, he dies eventually, probably of old age, you see that signs of stability in the country are starting to fall away. Next slide. Now this is a statue. This is probably not Gajah Mada. They say this is how he looks like, and I'm not 100% sure. I myself think he looks a bit like Anuk, which is a nephew of myself. But this is a terracotta statue that people say looks like Gajah Mada. But the problem is we don't know where this terracotta statue comes from, so it's probably not the case. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. Next slide. So he's quite an interesting character. What we also see, I just told you that maybe Hayawura was a kind of more of an artist than a politician, and maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but we do see a couple of things that are seemingly very important here. First of all, this is just a picture from the Banatran temple. This is not him, but it's just a beautiful illustration. He traveled almost every year for about 3 months, so there's a big effort, all across either Central Java or East Java to meet his people. So it was really important for him to travel around so that he would be seen by the people as the king, and also create alliances with the individual kabupaten, districts in his land. The picture that emerges is that Majapahit had a formidable navy that could sail all the way, probably into the southern Philippines, all the way definitely to Singapore and northern Sumatra, maybe beyond. We have some evidence that it probably went towards India as well. But then on the land, the power was probably so-so-ish, not as strong. There have been 2 invasions in Bali, once on the Gajah Negara, once on the Gajah Mada. So it wasn't that when they came in, they could fully control this particular island immediately. So these districts split off very, very quickly. The second one is also a picture of Banatran. It's the biggest state temple. This is a picture I made myself, 5 in the morning, woke up at 3 o'clock to the Jurukunchi open doors for us. Nice picture. It's a state temple that's far away from the center of where he lived, so he had to travel there. And in those days, that was quite a thing. It's probably 3-4 hour drive by the car now. So in those days, you probably took a boat on the Banatran River and then had to somehow sail or row upstream to get close to Blitar and then walk all the way up. So it was quite a journey here to make. But that's where the state temple is. And this is the temple I suggest you actually go and visit once. It's really beautiful. Now, and then we have other pictures on Banatran, which are great if you want to write a story like I try to do. But all sorts of details. This is the clothing people wear. They got dogs fighting. There was something in Pinocchio. There are ducks or something flying around. There's another one. And then there is some love stories here as well. You can see here a story, it's called Panji. Panji, I'm not sure how well known Panji actually is in Indonesian. These are all stories of a prince that travels around to look for his princess, but on the way he finds a lot of pacara, actually, quite a lot of affairs that he seems to have, and he discovers her in the end, and they unify. You can also see here music instruments, things like a gamelan. So we can find very nice, interesting details. These Panji stories were very popular because you suddenly see that in a lot of these temples they were depicted. And they form also the basis for some of the Wayang stories that later emerged. But some of the merchants that came to Majapahit likely heard these stories in the evenings as well. And they brought it back. If you go to Bangkok and you go to some of the temples, ask if they know the story of not Panji, Inau. Inau, I asked my Thai colleagues in the Bangkok office, do you know Inau? Everybody knows Inau. Inau at schools in Thailand, even today, is a classical sort of Saint Panji story. Prince runs away, has affairs, and then meets his princess. These stories live on in Thailand. And actually, they are depicted on the temples in Bangkok, the ones with all the gold around it. There are Panji Majapahit stories that came into Thailand, got transformed, and are still visible in Bangkok today. Next one. So, Majapahit, as soon as Gajah Mada does, as science is not so stable, we get very quickly thereafter actually an internal war. The splitting of the countries comes back. Again, Hayam Wuruk makes the same mistake as Langren by giving his land to two of his sons. They start to fight, it becomes a bit of a mess. But even before that, there are clear signs that the outskirts of what is the Majapahit Empire, the outskirts of what is Indonesia now, they try to break away. One story I like reading, an inscription, is from Brunei, whereby the people of Brunei told the king of China, Ming Dynasty at the time, we have a deal with Majapahit to send them so many thousands of pohon camphor trees every year, but we are willing to send them to you in China if you can tell Majapahit that the deal has changed. So they're trying to shield themselves towards China. You can see in Sumatra similar sort of movements as well. So the outskirts of what we call, say, the Majapahit Empire, they start to break quite quickly. Next, as we go deeper into the 1400s, it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out what is really true and what is really happened as well. Now, eventually, there's a Muslim empire or kind of kingdom rises. They attack, presumably Majapahit. Probably, I think, actually, maybe in the 1470s, but as I said, there's a narrative that's going to assume it's about the 1500s, because that's the start of what you would say modern Indonesia as well. This is a picture from Raffles. He had somebody show him. He arrived in Majapahit. I went to Singasari. He hardly went to Majapahit itself because it was all in forest. So certain temples, there's a description of a Dutch resident in Surabaya who goes to what is now Banjarnatu, the temple I showed you earlier on, and he has to hack himself through the forest in the middle of the night and see suddenly a temple which is not Banjarnatu. It also means that the people who live there now, although they sometimes claim that they are the original Majapahit people, they weren't living there when Raffles was there. They're probably people that came from Central Java and just went there over time. And Majapahit becomes more of a legend for a long time, until there's a war between the Dutch and the Balinese in Lombok. And there's a philologist, somebody who's good in all languages, who is at the war in Lombok in 1894, right? Which you mentioned earlier on, and I've got dated. 1894, he's in that war between the two sides. The Dutch burned down the whole Watch Keraton, a temple, a royal palace, and he snatches away before the fire all books that he could grab. And one of them is the writings of a monk, the son of probably the Buddhist, head of the Buddhist kind of realm in Majapahit. His name is Pravaja, and he traveled with Hayam Wuruk on one of these trips through East Java. And he got a description, I'm going to travel with them, and actually this is how Majapahit looks like, and we have a tower here, this is from iron, this is from wood. So it's a beautiful description that I've used in order to use it in the book as well. He travels around the city, and some of it is a bit boring. He says, we're going to go to A first, and then we go to B, and then to C, and D, E, E. And you don't find these places actually on a map back in there's been a guy here in Bali who's traveled all that place. Yeah, he recently died, unfortunately. Or somebody here in Bali who's been very active in trying to revive that particular trip. He also says, at the end of the book, he was born at about the same time as Hayam Wuruk, so they probably played together because, well, their father is the chief priest, and probably your best friend or one of your friends is going to be the prince who's going to be the next king. They were different in character. Hayam Wuruk was a guy who liked the arts and dancing. This Babaja guy was a monk, or his father was a religious kind of man, but he liked to drink. He liked to party a bit, probably. He was probably a bit lonely. As I said earlier on, he clearly says he wants to have an issue with your wife, and he tries, but he fails. And the lady says, you're not romantic, you smell really bad, so I'm not going to go with him, and he gives up. He likes books, he likes writing, and at the end of the book, he says, well, probably nobody's going to like this book. It's a bit of a boring book with a description, and oh my God, I'm a failure with women as well. I'm a bit of a failure in life. But here we are. He tells us something about himself, which is quite beautiful, and that we have signs of life coming from that particular century. And now it is one of the most famous books in Indonesian history, the Nagara Katagama, and in the National Library. If you ever go there in Jakarta, go to the 11th floor, just ask them if you can see it, then take it out. I made a picture of it. Here it is. This is how his writing looked like. Actually, this is not what he wrote down. This is a copy. You can get to copy these books. These were copied in Bali, right here, because the Balinese, when Majapahit fell, a lot of people went here. They liked this book because it's got the description of life in Majapahit, their ancestors. So the Balinese, they thought this is worth to be retranslated and rewritten on the time. And one of the Balinese guys writes down, this is the Nagara Katagama, that's where the name actually comes from. And then lastly, otherwise I've gone over my time, I'm sure already, Majapahit is still around. The Lego, that's the Balinese culture, of course, is a big sort of illustration there. But we find it in Thailand, we see it in the Thai. But maybe most importantly, and this is the last thing I want to say. I told you there are 3 reasons for writing this book, and one I will tell you at the very end. Majapahit was a place where Arabs, Chinese, Indians, probably Omani people, I went to a museum in Oman, and there seems to be things there, Japanese, Ambonese, all sorts of people came there together, and there's no sign that there was rift between these people. Indeed, if anything, I would say there's one word that's been associated with it, it's tolerance. And actually, if you extend that to a large extent, this country itself is to a large extent based on that similar sort of tolerance that emerged as a way of living and combining so many suku, bahasa, and agama in this country, religions, backgrounds, traditions, they can all be unified so very nicely in this country. And if anything, this goes back to my colleagues, and then I'm finishing off. If there is anything that comes from Majapahit and Indonesia that the rest of the world should learn, because we're living in Europe and in America to a large extent, in a world of less tolerance, more opposition, not accepting each other or other people. It's something that in Europe in particular, but I would say probably the US as well, we really struggle, they really struggle with. And maybe one of the lessons that come from Indonesia and actually originates from Majapahit is that you can live together and be very tolerant. Thank you very much.
It's very interesting to a point where I myself question how long does it take to build your analysis and the basis that you use to build this book. But then, okay, kita bisa simpan itu untuk sesi pertanyaan nanti. Dan kita juga akan mengundang Pak Jun untuk menyampaikan materi, pandangan, sanggahannya terhadap isi buku yang sudah dibaca maupun materi yang sudah diberikan oleh Pak Herald, dan mungkin juga wejangannya untuk teman-teman dari arkeologi selaku Gen Z, selaku generasi muda yang seringkali lupa terhadap sejarah Pak di tanahnya sendiri di Pulau Dewata.
Ya, kalau melupakan sejarah karena sejarahnya membosankan ya wajar aja. So, I would like to start by, saya ingin tanya dari teman-teman mahasiswa di belakang, berapa orang Bali? Yang orang Bali angkat tangannya. Tolong berdiri ya, berdiri. Ada yang mau saya tanyakan. Jadi, Herald ended his explanation by saying that Majapahit doesn't end, it still continues, and I would like to try to prove it. Yang paling depan namanya siapa? Alif, nama lengkap? Igusti Putu Alif Putu Mahendra. From his name, I could deduce that he belonged to a knight family, not a ruling royal family, but from the house of nobility. Gusti, dari Puri? Oh, Arya Sulang, Arya Pinate. So, he belongs to the Pinate clan.
In Balinese hierarchy stages.
Now, those who use Arya Pinate could trace back their history, their ancestors to Majapahit. Kalau Sorohnya berarti yang paling atas Pinate Wangbang. Silakan dulu Gusti, yang dua yang dulu. So his ancestors, his direct ancestor is Arya Wangbang Pinate. Arya Wangbang Pinate is the son of Danyang Sidimantra. So Danyang Sidimantra is a sage from pre-Majapahit era, and who sent his son to Bali to seek the dragon Basuki. So this is one of the earliest settler of the island. Yang di tengah nama? Imadi Aditya. Imadi, the word Imadi is from Madhya. Madhya means beef. So he's the second born from a commoner family. But there's no such thing as commoner in Bali actually. Because most of the Balinese is the descendants of the warrior class. When they defeated in the war, they voluntarily resigned their knight or warrior status. Mati seorang mana? Bujangga Waisnawa. So this is the coming from a family, the spiritual ruler of Bali before the arrival of Siwaistik Hindu to Bali. So this is the Vaisnava, the Vishnu believer. Thank you, Madi. Silakan duduk. Ya, terus.
Putu gede Mitra.
Putu gede.
Bayi Tanaya.
Oh, bayi. So firstborn. Sorong mana? Kawitan ya?
Ya kawitan. Kawitan Pulasari.
Dalam.
Oh, dalam.
So
Dalam Pulasari.
this is the finest evidence that he's now from his name is a commoner, Putu. But his ancestors is from the bluest of blue royal family, Dalam Pulasari, the reigning king of Bali. And when they use the title Dalam in front of their names, it means they directly related to Majapahit. Silakan dulu tuh. What I want to prove is each and every Balinese in contemporary Bali today is ours. Know exactly they are born on which family, who were their ancestors, and what part, what historical role their ancestors played throughout the history of this island. Majapahit, as a sovereign nation, ended somewhere in the late 14th century. It was immortalized in a literary work, Kidung Sutta. In a poetic term, sirna ilang kertaning bumi. So now disappear and perish this prosperous nation. That marked the end of Majapahit as a sovereign nation. But as a cultural entity, Majapahit still exists up until now in Bali, in East Java, and gradually all over Indonesia. In Bali, for decades, for centuries, Majapahit has been put on pedestal by Balinese scholar, Balinese intellectual, Balinese freedom fighters as the idealized and idolized perfect state. And why the book will be very important? Because to a certain extent, it will help the Indonesian understand Majapahit not through a romantic tint, not through an idealized perspective, but through a much more realistic perspective. Majapahit still exists in Bali right now. If you speak with Balinese, most of them will explain to you how proud they are of being the descendant of Majapahit and how peaceful they are. How they want that this island will once again regain the glory of Majapahit. There is a movement actually in Bali to return to the golden age of Majapahit. Majapahit is seen as the perfect example and the pinnacle of cultural Hindu Renaissance. And now there is also a resurgence of this belief among non-Balinese. If you travel to Mojokerto, there is a growing community who works in social and cultural field to return this glory era. Why there is a resurgence? Because in the last 10 years, Indonesia also facing a rising religious fundamentalism. Not only in Muslim majority area, but also in Bali. Bali right now is also facing the similar challenge, the rising Hindu fundamentalism. If in Java the Turkish president Erdogan was seen as the Muslim hero, here in Bali we see a growing numbers of Balinese youth looking up at Modi and Bharatiya Janata Party, very actually a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist party. So we are, as a country, as a nation, Indonesia, with our official logo is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, taken from a literary word born in Hayam Buruk era, is now in dire need for the resurgence of Majapahit religious tolerance, as we are as a nation facing the rising religious fundamentalism. And that's also another reason why this book is important. Now, on the book, my first impression is, the moment I read the preface, I was so proud because I instantly recognized two names. First is Jarah Sastrawan, and the second one is Adrian Vickers. Adrian is a close friend of mine, and Jarah is just like a son to me. He's the son of my close friend. Jarah is what I call a new breed of Balinese. His father is Balinese. His mother is an Australian by citizenship, but Dutch by Holland by blood. Studied quantum mechanics and classical Greek literatures in Sydney Uni. Then getting his doctorate in Sanskrit and ancient Japanese language. So I was proud, and I think both the authors truly picked a good source. So this must be a very good book. I went directly to the endnotes and saw two additional names I love, Chow Chu Kwa and Mah Wan. The Chinese is the most fanatic recorder of history. From Mah Wan, we have a report on the countries in the Eastern Sea, which also depict the Majapahit Kraton in a very detailing description. Chow Chu Kwa is basically a guy with too many free time on his hand. So he's a sea harbor master. So he interviewed every captains, every sailors, every navigators that arrived in the harbor about their country, the custom, etc. So we have a very good detailed description about the countries. So this book is very informative, using very good sources, and the fifth names that I recognize is in Bali, we respect him so much, Pak Sido Hadimulyo, an expert in ancient Japanese texts and science, who just passed away some 2 months ago. So, the source is good. The primary source is Pararaton, basically the Chronicle of Kings from the Kediri to Singosari era, then the Desawartana, the Negara Kertajama, which Prapansa wrote, Chronicle Majapahit, and I think you also use Babat Tanah Jawi, and Babat Tanah Jawi, which chronicles the end of Majapahit, the rise of Demak, and the demise of Demak. Later on, the rise of Jipang, Pajang, and then Mataram, in a continuation from the Hindu Empire to the Muslim Empire. I already read these through 3 chronicles, Pararaton, Desawartana, and Babat Tanah Jawi. And I must say, although these 3 texts is very important for Indonesia, history, but as a reader, it's not a very enjoyable text. It's dry. It's only a compilation of persons, of their deeds. There is no feeling what Kertanegara felt when the Wurawari king stormed his palace. There is no such thing as emotional narrative. So basically a dry text, and this is the main reason why history in Indonesia is so boring. The authors of these 3 texts, including Prapanca, detail the action, but most often forget to explain the motive of the main characters, the emotion involved. Can you imagine Ken Arok kill Tugala to get his wife, the most beautiful girls in Mount Kawi area Jalan, to marry him? In whole Pararaton, there is no explanation or description of the feeling of Herdetes, this woman who had to marry a murderer who just killed his husband. There is no explanation. This book was filled with emotion. Somehow you got the feeling, the aspiration of Prapanca, a sexually challenged monk. It really surprised me to read the first paragraph about Prapanca. Mind you, this is one of the most respected figure in Bali, Prapanca Tatular, and Barada, the guy who stuck on the tamarind tree. And this that was not the first failure of Barada. That's the second failure. The second failure, he stuck on a tamarind tree. The first failure, he failed to predict whether the egg in the ocean, there's one egg floating in the ocean, contain a baby chicken or a baby dragon. This is the first connection between Bali and Majapahit. Actually, Bali is responsible for the creation of Majapahit. So when Dharmawangsa Erlangga sent tasked Barada to divide the kingdom, Barada traveled to Bali. His older brother was the senior advisor of the king of Bali. His name is Puturan. Senapati Rajakerta Empu Ing Puturan is his full name. And Barada asked his brothers, I want to prevent a major political division in Java, which could lead to a civil war. So I want to take one of Erlangga's sons to Bali and enthrone him as the king of Bali. Erlangga has two brothers, biological brothers in Bali, Marakata Pangkaya and anak bungsu. Kuturan, the older brother of Barada said, you could not do that because we already have a crown prince here. Barada defiant, and true to its day, they all love gambling. So Barada challenged Kuturan on a gambling bet. Kuturan threw a net into the ocean and told Barada, if you could predict what inside the egg, we will let the Japanese prince become king in Bali. Barada lost the bet, traveled back to Java, trying to divide the kingdom, got stuck in the Tamarind tree, double failure. Only a Dutch, a Holland author could write this, because if it were a Balinese to write this kind of thing, there will be an uproar. What? Prapanca important? Not only important, but also for the others, and socially awkward. And there was no Tinder at that time, so Prapanca spent the remaining of his days without the comfort of a woman. So that this is unlike Pararaton, unlike Dasawarnana, unlike Babat Tanah Jawi. This book is a very enjoyable reading. It's like you read a novel. The only difference is, in this book, there are a lot of main characters, and all of them get killed. In Majapahit, winter is coming for all of them. No one was spared. And the second one, it's not only enjoyable from a dramatic side, but it's also a kind of a situational comedy in which the authors break the fourth wall and insert his commentary. So one of the most respected figures in Bali is Aji Saka. He's on the level of prophet in Bali, because we Balinese believe that Aji Saka arrived to Nusantara, Indonesia, and brought with him not only calendars but also script. So Balinese alphabet and Japanese alphabet were attributed to Aji Saka. But Pak Herbert dengan santai, innocently, right? Aji Saka, the same merchant. Kurung, what a good title. A Balinese doesn't have the guts to write like that. Aji Saka is God for us, because if you know Nyepi, Balinese Day of Silence to start our New Year's, it's based on Aji Saka calendar. It marks the start of Saka lunisolar calendars. Now, how Herbert defined Brahma is also very hilarious. You have to read it. How Pak Herbert described Kertajaya, one of the feared king in East Java. There's so many roads in Surabaya named Jalan Kertajaya. How he defined this king is in a hilarious, humorous way. The spare-sitting king, because Kertajaya loved to boast, to flaunt his supernatural ability by sitting cross-legged on the tip of the spear. So these Dutch writers give Kertajaya a unique name, a spare-sitting king. So it's enjoyable, it's informative, it's humorous, and this humorous make it more captivating than one of the classic novel about Majapahit in contemporary Indonesia. Pernah dengar Senopati Pamungkas? So there's a series of novel Senopati Pamungkas, kemudian dilanjutkan dengan kitab Tanah Air, kemudian Tembang Merdeka, ditulis oleh almarhum Arswendo Atmowiloto. It basically narrate the end of Singasari and the rise of Majapahit. Melodramatic, tragic, romantic, but not humorous. So this still winning at that department. So that's my brief impression about this book. But I believe the impact, hopefully Perry Blues could get a good Indonesian translators and not Balinese. Because in Bali, Majapahit is still alive. Not only in art, in cultures like Legong, etc., but also in spirituality. But Balinese Hindu religions is basically the Majapahit version of Hinduism. The grandest of ceremony in Bali, the cremation ceremony, is the exact replica of Sraddha ceremony in Majapahit time. That's the first recorded Hindu cremation actually in Nusantara, the Sraddha in Majapahit. And during the Majapahit era, it's only reserved for the nobility. The commoner like me, Wayan Juniata, before I took my last breath, my son, I have son, Prapanca. My son will ask me, Pak, when you pass away, do you want me to throw your body to the river or to the forest? This is true. So for commoners, there are two most common way of post-death ritual: by throwing to the rivers or to the forest, the dead body. It is recorded by Mahwan in his report after visiting Majapahit. Now in Balinese Hinduism, everybody got this grand cremation with only one small difference. In the old times, when I die, my wife will have to jump into the funeral fire to show her loyalty. If my wife die, I have to. Because I have still other remaining wife I have to attend to. So it's a very humanist reason or humanist reason. So thankfully this Sati in Majapahit also called Sati was abolished in I believe in early 90s. Not by Balinese intellectual, not by Balinese spiritual figures, not by Prapanca, but by the Dutch administration. So to a certain extent, the Dutch colonialization on Bali also brought many positive impact. One of the most important impact is the preservation and conservation of Balinese archaeological artifacts. Teman-teman arkeologi sini pasti tahu bahwa arca Anaconda yang di Trunyan itu dulu hampir runtuh dan semata-mata bisa diselamatkan karena ada arkeolog Belanda yang berhasil masuk ke dalam, masang beton dan tidak tersambar petir. Jadi kepercayaan masyarakat di sana kalau ada orang yang tidak suci masuk ke sana itu akan disambar petir. Petirnya begitu turun tiba-tiba, oh ini Tuan Belanda gitu. Aduh. Setelah selesai program konservasi itu, orang Belanda ini dipanggilnya Tuan Mangku oleh penduduknya. Karena itulah saya kemudian tadi bilang, Albertnya harusnya kita panggil guru. Karena di Bali, guru itu artinya ahli ahli dalam teks dan dalam lagu dalam bidang tertentu gitu. Nah, Bapak ini udah baca Pararaton, udah baca Babat Tanah Jawi, udah baca Desa Warnana gitu. Jadi sudah pantas kalau kita panggil guru. Jadi impact, the last important impact I think that for this book is it will serve as a perfect gateway for Indonesian young students, children to learn about the history of their people in an interesting way. The problem with our young generation is not that they don't want to learn about history, but the way the history being taught in this country is so fucking boring. So untuk Pak Yanwar cariin translator Indonesia, saya yakin laris ya. Cuma pesan saya jangan orang Bali. Karena kalau orang-orang Bali ngerti sebagian besar pertaruh kawin dan kita yang dibicarakan. Thank you.
Untuk teman-teman yang hadir secara offline maupun yang daring mungkin bisa langsung membeli maupun check out di e-commerce yang ada di berbagai platform ya, di karapus.com. Dan tanpa berlama-lama lagi, since the time is running out, and kita akan buka penanya untuk sesi pertama 3 orang, boleh angkat tangannya untuk membuka sesi interaktif antara pembicara dan juga teman-teman yang sudah hadir dalam book discussion hari ini. Dan mungkin di akhir sesi nanti kita tetap juga akan adakan foto bersama ya, dan juga book signing untuk teman-teman yang sudah beli maupun membawa buku Majapahitnya pada discussion book hari ini. Mungkin ada yang mau bertanya teman-teman dari arkeologi yang sudah kepancing tadi dari pertanyaannya Pak Jun, mohon jangan bersedih. Untuk teman-teman yang di belakang, or sebetulnya I'm really curious onto your journey and your process throughout the making of these books. Like how long did it take you, and the struggles, of course. I believe it's not easy to translate traditional transcripts into a readable and enjoyable novels.
So it took me over 3 years. COVID probably helped because my boss still was working from home. My love is also very great help. Also, sometimes she complained a bit too much in every second. Sanya was writing, and I would ask her in the morning, "What are you doing?" She says, "Why don't you do this?" I said, "Good," because then I was alone at home and I could just write. But my wife helps in ways that she probably doesn't know. Not only support, but also small comments. For example, if I describe that something happens in the city and there's a flame train, then I ask her, is the flame train there? Morning, atau rambutan dan durian sama musiknya? Oh, she says, dan morning, durian, rambutan dulu, baru durian, baru durian. At least I know that there's some very small details in it that, of course, I get from my wife. I've also, and I must say this, the people, the experts that I've approached, Jahar Sastrawan, Adrian Vickers, there's a lady in London, Lester Pullen, Shiramoyo, these experts, instead of saying, who are you, we don't know you, bugger off from here, this is my website, you can find something, they were incredibly helpful. There is a gentleman in Malawan, on all of the trips that we did to all the temples, accompanied us in Europe, and told me all the stories of the things that I would see and helped me to translate that. So, I mean, very helpful experts in that sense. Then you write, it's actually almost writing 3 books. First you write a book with some academic books, so that you got your facts right. Then you write the stories you think you're going to put it, then it takes me 8 months to put in the small details that, for example, he was a saint, merchant saint, and that was a nice title. So you reread it, you try to draft it, to create a story that's very easy to read. And sometimes you have to take distance from it, wait for a couple of months before you go back and reread it yourself and say, oh, no, this doesn't flow very good, so I have to reread it. But that's kind of the finishing of the story. It's a lovely process to do. I really enjoyed it. It's addictive for me. So I hope that I can do another one at some point in time.
Any other question, perhaps, before I continue with my own question? Seems like I'm the only one being curious here for some reason. But then it also became interesting by the fact that sejarah itu pada akhirnya akan terulang, either the good ones or the bad ones. Now, looking back to the Menkes era in 1219, like Donald Trump was lately shocked, at least his ears, that is the idea of political aggression and political instability and the idea of negotiation and diplomacy, which is still being used in ilmu international and international relations, is the primary source as to how history is repeating itself, whether the good ones or the bad ones. My question is, do we really have to repeat the bad ones in contemporary era?
It seems that we don't always learn the lessons from history, so therefore we do repeat the same mistakes. In many ways, in politics, geopolitics, we go through history, but also maybe this is a nice way to bring the Indonesia to it. My continent, where I was born, Europe, is an absolute mess. We got wars, we got big countries, Yugoslavia falling apart. My own country, the Netherlands, we have invaded Indonesia, right? Now we've been invaded by the Norwegians, they were the Vikings. The French invaded, the Spanish sometimes invaded, the Germans invaded, not to get that. Exactly. So nearly anybody in Europe is trying to invade because we're a flat country, it's easy to penetrate, not too many people anyway. So we've been invaded by all sorts of people. So unity is something that European history tells us is incredibly difficult to achieve. And even now, although Europe is trying to come together with the Euro and these sort of things, you also see that movements are popping up in Europe, which, as I said, look more at opposing each other and benefit from that than instead of bringing people together. And maybe there are things we can learn, hopefully, from maybe what about energy in Indonesia last year, that it is possible to live together.
Well, if I may add, and we learn from these two great empires in the past, Sriwijaya and Majapahit. Both empires are classified as thalassocratic nations. So basically, a sovereign nation that rules on the coastal area. And this is the reason why they can dominate the Southeast Asia region, because their military, their navy, both Sriwijaya and Majapahit, put a chokehold on the Malacca Strait, the primary waterways that connect Nusantara to China and India. The moment Sriwijaya lost its naval glory, it's also lost its status as a powerful nation. The same things happened to Majapahit. After Majapahit is replaced by another coastal power, Demak Bintara. Demak has, at that time in Jepara, the largest shipyard in Southeast Asia that could produce 300 mid-sized warships in just 1.5 years. That the Crown Prince then used to storm Malacca to attack the Portuguese. Demak launched the strike 2 times. The first one with 300 strong warship. The second one with around 100 strong warship. They became the biggest naval power in Nusantara. But the moment later on, after Jipang, Pajang, and then Mataram rose to prominence, and Java, for the first time, has a king with acute military ability, unlike Hayam Wuruk. His name is Sultan Agung Hanyokrokusmo, who launched 2 military campaigns against Batavia. The problem with the Sultan is he chose to look into the ocean and rather embrace the agricultural hinterland. So the orientation changed. Nusantara from the thalassocratic nation, from a naval power, turned into an agricultural power. Sultan Agung decided to burn, to raise the shipyard in Jepara. And this is the reason why Mataram failed in its military campaign to Batavia, because the Dutch used the naval force to destroy all the logistical storage along the northern coastal of Java. So the moment Indonesia forget its root as a thalassocratic nation, a coastal nation, and choose instead to be a hinterland nation, we will fail to be a true power in Southeast Asia. Kalau Bali paling parah ya, sepanjang sejarah kerajaan-kerajaan di Bali kita tidak pernah punya angkatan laut. Tapi kita punya uang. Jadi kita sewa bajak laut dari Sulawesi. Jadi setelah perang saudara di Sulawesi antara Hasanuddin dengan siapa namanya? Musuhnya Hasanuddin ini, Hasanuddin menang jadi sultan. Arun Palaka, rivalnya, kemudian membara di laut. Sebagian prajuritnya kemudian disewa oleh Diponegoro dalam perang Jawa. Sebagian lagi disewa oleh raja-raja Bali untuk memerangi Mataram Islam. Jadi bayangin itu. Jadi pasukan Mataram yang mencoba masuk Bali, ini orang Islam, dibegal oleh bajak laut Makassar yang beragama Islam. Jadi point in the making, di Indonesia tidak pernah terjadi perang agama. Jadi sering orang Bali menganggap bahwa Majapahit Hindu dikalahkan oleh Demak Bintara Islam. Tidak begitu ceritanya. Jadi dalam perang antara Majapahit Barat dengan Majapahit Timur, di kedua belah pihak ini ada bangsawan-bangsawan Muslim, ada prajurit-prajurit Muslim. Kalau saya tidak salah, Patih Udara itu dari Keraton Barat itu Muslim. Jadi tidak pernah agama yang menjadi alasannya. Alasannya adalah perebutan wilayah. Jadi dalam perang Taragulak ini, Hindu bunuh Hindu, Islam bunuh Islam, yang mencelaka orang Cina. Serius, ada 400 prajurit dan duta besar Cina terjebak di Keraton Timur dibunuh. Jadi Raja Cina marah, denda Raja Jawa, kalau saya tidak salah 4.000 tael emas. Tapi kemudian Raja Jawa minta icil. Jadi itulah awal mula lahirnya tradisi kita dicicil. Setelah 2 tahun tidak lunas, akhirnya Kaisar Cina, kasihan kan, dikasihlah pemutihan. Jadi kalau teman-teman sekarang melihat bahwa di Republik Indonesia ini sering dicicil, sering pemutihan, sering meroyok orang dan salah korbannya, artinya Anda keturunan Majapahit.
It was fantastic. Very nice. No, I came to Indonesia with Pakistan there. Actually, I think when the head was finding out about this here as well. Because 2 or 3 years ago when I started writing, I tried to approach some publishers. I said I'm writing this book about Majapahit. I wrote a book about Jakarta I mentioned earlier. That was with a Singapore-based publisher. And they, to be honest, they're not the only one. But the response I get from publishers is that nobody outside of Indonesia is reading about Majapahit. Inside Indonesia, people are interested in history. Turns out, when we arrive here, we're in town, we're in culture, actually there's quite an interest in people. The interest is that the medium that being used to teach is probably not correct. And then there's a bit of necessity.
Oh, yeah.
Because also, so YouTube videos, huge following, huge following. So I think the demand to understand your own institutions is quite good. And hopefully, people will read the book. It's a gateway to actually do it.
Boleh tepuk tangan sekali. Waktu 4 sore lebih banyak, kita langsung saja menutup diskusi hari ini. Teman-teman boleh berdiri, tempat masing-masing. Kita lakukan sesi foto bersama dengan Pak Heri dan juga Pak Dwi. Teman-teman boleh berdiri, yes. Would you Untuk teman-teman yang di belakang yang merasa agak rendah, mungkin bisa maju merawakan diri ke depan supaya terlihat eksistensinya ya. Sudah hadir di discussion hari ini. Pak Surya mungkin juga bisa maju Pak ke depan Pak, kalau bisa Pak.